Hello and welcome to Sanguinius 40k, your go-to channel for competitive Blood Angel tactics and tips on how to get the most out of your Sons of Sanguinius on the tabletop. I'm Sam, and let's dive in. In today's video, we're going to be taking a quick look at the balanced data slate and how it affected Blood Angels in every aspect, whether it be directly or indirectly. All right, so the first rule we're going to take a look at for how it affected Blood Angels is, of course, the Armor of Contempt. So we're not going to dive too deep into every single rule here today. I do really want to focus on Blood Angels, as I always like to do. But the Armor of Contempt, the way that reads is each time an attack is allocated to an Adeptus Astartes, Sanctic Astartes, Heretic Astartes, or Adeptus Sororitas model, worsen the armor penetration characteristic of that attack by 1. So the other caveat that would affect us is that models equipped with a Storm Shield, so things such as our Vanguard veterans or our Blade Guard veterans would not be under the effects of an additional save for that matter. So those wouldn't stack, unfortunately. However, some of our most key and most reliable, or at least for myself, units that I've relied on are Sanguinary Guard and Death Company. They've seen an absolutely massive buff from a rule such as this. And a really quick example of that is even things such as Shuriken Cannons coming in that can spike their AP and are now AP 1, flat 2 damage, which really hurt us. All of a sudden, if you stick that Death Company in cover, we have a 2-up save. We ignore that initial AP 1. That AP 3 only counts as AP 2. And we still are able to ignore damage with the Death Company. So, I mean, a unit such as that all of a sudden has seen a massive buff from something like this. Now, of course, I'm not encouraging you to stick your Death Company out in the open and just touch a ruin and hope you're going to survive, because, of course, we are still Marines and we will still roll our 1s and 2s depending on what we're being shot at. But definitely some great food for thought, and definitely a little more thinking on your opponent's end of how to actually efficiently trade into some of our key units. And the next change we're going to be taking a look at is indirect fire weapons. So this is a bit of a bigger paragraph, so bear with me. But the wording is, an indirect fire weapon is one that can target units that are not visible to the bearer. If such a weapon targets a unit that is not visible, so there's no ability for the unit to essentially see them, then each time an attack is made with that weapon against that target this phase, worsen the ballistic skill characteristic of that attack by 1, and add 1 to any armor saving throws made against that attack. So, I mean, for a lot of us in the meta and have been going through competitive 40k for the past, I want to say, year or so, we have really been feeling the effects of indirect, and it's actually hemorrhaged our ability to, do well at points, whether it been the, buggy spam with the rocket truck squig buggies, whether it be obviously Hive Guard, who have been a huge problem to, I think, everybody in the meta. Sometimes games just didn't feel viable, or even like there was much of a game, because just a lot of resources would be gone due to indirect by turn 3 most of the time. So this has been an actually huge indirect buff, no pun intended, to how our army is going to be able to function and be a little bit more freely adaptable on the board, and where we place our models, just a lot more oomph that we can have in certain areas now without having to lose units out of line of sight, without even having to trade. I guess this kind of goes back to GW trying to make the game a bit more interactive and have less indirect, be more viable, which I think is very healthy from a game standpoint, and definitely going to be huge for us in the long run. So this, combined with the Armor of Contempt, is 2 massive buffs, both directly and indirectly. All right, so those were the main changes that actually are really going to help our faction in terms of how we're going to build our list and how we're going to approach the board. But let's just talk quickly about some of the biggest nerfs that came in to Custodes, to Harlequins, and Tao especially. So all 3 of them, and how those have indirectly helped us now. So let's take a look at Custodes first off. Essentially, they got hit, I believe, one of the hardest out of those 3 factions. I mean, maybe because it was due to them being out the longest and them having more of a lengthy, reign of terror, so to speak. But this definitely has helped us a lot, because Custodes have been super tough for all Marines to play into, just because they kind of do what we want, but 5 times better. So, I mean, with only troops having OBSEC, now we're able to contest areas of the board a little bit easier, have a little bit more interactivity in that sense without really, sacrificing too much to do so. Or at least killing their OBSEC is actually more of a viable plan now, because, I mean, in theory, there shouldn't be as much now as there used to be. Another huge thing is the fact that they can only use specific stratagems once per game, which is actually quite big. Those are just going to be a couple listed here, which is Esteemed Amalgam, Emperor's Auspice, and Martial Discretion. So for those three, it's really going to be a lot more thinking on the Custodes player's end, which is actually a lot better for the game and healthier from a actual tactical standpoint, in my opinion. The last part, which is actually quite interesting as well, is the fact that only Custodes infantry can now use Arcane Genetic Alchemy and Emperor's Auspice stratagems. So that's actually huge, as those 9 bikes lists were really relying a lot on those really simple 1 CP strats to essentially become, or what felt like, unkillable. But now all of a sudden, if we have those 3 Eradicators with Chapter Master shooting into 3 bikes, they are absolutely have a high percentage chance of going down, rather than before where it felt like it didn't really do much at all. So I mean, this has been a massive indirect buff, and definitely something for us to keep in mind when building our lists again. All right, so moving on from the Custodes, we're going to hit right on into the Harlequins. And actually, the Harlequins, believe it or not, I don't think have been bad touched as bad as they deserve to be. Reason being is because although the Mirror Architect Pivotal role has changed, light is still going to be tough to shift in many cases, and the big problem with just that army in general is actually the simple ability baked into their datasheets, which is the Mirage Launchers, which just make those vehicles and those chassities very tough to shift. I don't think this was enough, personally, in my opinion, and I definitely think there could have been a lot more room for adjustments, just in a positive way. I think something simple such as Mirage Launchers only working against range attacks could have been a good start, because it doesn't really make sense that when you're located right next to the boat, that Thunderhammer can't really benefit from any rerolls that we're trying to swing into it. A little bit of a silly one on my part, but don't want to critique too hard. Maybe there's something coming down the road that we have no idea about. Who knows? So that's kind of the first thing that caught my eye. I mean, the next part definitely is going to be favor of Segorach's Warlord trait change. That one is definitely going to be feeling a lot better in terms of how that's going to be applied now to the person, or the bear, I should say, where it's going to be a melee, a hit roll, rather than shooting, which felt like a lot when you applied that onto the Death Chester. So definitely a good change there. Definitely feels a little bit more of a healthier change, and definitely, again, allows, or at least it tries to make you a bit more interactive with who you put that on, which is nice to see. The biggest changes, again, indirectly helping us, is the change to Star Weavers and, of course, to Void Weavers, the menace and the terror of the current meta. Definitely a huge heavy-handed hit on Void Weavers, which was, I think, much deserved. And you know what? Sadly to say, at 130, I think they're still quite viable for what they do and how hard they are to shift. You're just not going to see 9 anymore, but I definitely could see. I could definitely see 3 to 4. So either 3 single units, or 2 two-mans, for example, definitely being a viable shooting platform for them. Definitely Star Weavers going up is definitely a good thing for us, because that is their entire means of mobility and transportation. So I mean, in theory, them going up too should definitely see some changes for how they interact with the board. I personally think this is a bit of an easy way out for Harlequins, however, because they can just now shift from light and go into dark, and just kind of get away from Void Weavers altogether. Maybe run a couple of small Skyweaver units, run Star Weavers almost the same way they've been doing, and just go heavier on the troops, which actually obviously provides more OBSEC now into that army, which gives them another bane to how to deal with them. But you know what? I think it's just a lot about adaptation, and this does, in theory, it does promote a bit more interactivity, which is definitely healthy long-term for the game. But like I mentioned a few times now, I definitely do not think this was enough to the Harlequins. But like I said, we'll hold our breaths. We'll see what the meta has to come, and we'll see what changes they bring. All right, and the last balanced data slate change that we're going to be covering today is the Tao Empire and how it affected the Blood Angels. The first bullet point immediately is definitely a huge indirect buff for us. The fact that we're actually changing the second bullet point of the Maka ability, which for those of you who don't remember is the additional AP within the specific ranges. That's gone altogether now, so that additional AP, like I mentioned, is gone. And now instead it's just reroll a wound roll of 1, which of course is still a nice buff on their end, but that extra AP was absolutely detrimental to how it interacted with us, and especially indirect like SMS going to AP2 within 18 inches. Airburst fragmentation was just kind of like going to AP1 for kind of no reason, it felt like, and was kind of unnecessary. And by the way, especially with SMS ignoring cover, that really, really did hurt us, even when it was at AP1 to begin with. So the AP2 was just a lot. So now this change, combined with the fact that indirect actually has been quite heavily nerfed, has been a huge additional help for how we, again, set up on the board, interact with the board, and can actually feel comfortable when we're actually out of line of sight for once, which sounds crazy, but it really hasn't been a good time for us when we're hiding behind walls as of late. So that's definitely been huge. The next part that has changed, which doesn't really change too much to help us at all, but it's just interesting, is the fact that each time a model with the Tenet, I believe, is devastating counterstrike for Farside Enclaves, makes a ranged attack that targets a unit within 9. The target is treated as having a marker light token. So that's just definitely a little bit of a change there, which does, of course, shift things in the right way to make that rule a bit more, a bit more appropriate, so to speak. The next point is the removal of core from the broadside battlesuit datasheet, which is very big. The broadsides were a huge offender of SMS, as they would essentially just sit behind a wall and shoot you with 24 SMS shots, and they're also quite tough to shift in general. So they would essentially be shooting you for roughly 4 to 5 turns if you didn't address them. And even if you did address them, probably the first 2 or 3, they'd be absolutely making it rain from behind a wall or while you were behind a wall. So again, like mentioned before, the removal of core now to seeing their efficiency go down quite significantly, plus the indirect changes, has seen a definite buff for us. And like I said, with how we build our army and how we want to approach the table. The last part is actually adding the following to repulsor impact field and photon grenade stratagem. So the charge roll modifier incurred via this stratagem is not cumulative with any other negative modifier to a unit's charge roll. So this is actually interesting because now all of a sudden we're not getting those stacking minuses, which were essentially -4, or I believe if you were going through a forest, it could go to something crazy like -6, which just becomes kind of unbearable and becomes a bit crazy. And the only way we could really charge Tau effectively to begin with was by actually just deep striking jump pack units and using Descent of Angels to ignore all charge modifiers to begin with. But who really wants to rely on a game plan of rolling an 8? And hey, for those of you who do, keep doing you and enjoy it. But from a competitive standpoint, it's just very difficult to incorporate that into the strategy and game plan. And then of course, when you're on the table, then they'll be just making those essentially 7-inch charges become 9, and et cetera, et cetera. So definitely good to know that we can at least mitigate how far we're reducing our charge rolls, and we can actually prepare to be within certain distances, just knowing that there's only going to be a maximum amount of minuses that we're going to be incurring in the process. So definitely, again, another big indirect change, and definitely going to help us in the future approaching the matchup against Tau. All right, and that's a wrap for today's video covering the balanced data slate changes and how the Blood Angels have been, essentially helped by it in this situation. So yeah, please, let me know any way that I can improve my content, or if there's any kind of topics that I can cover to help you guys grow and help you guys each as players in the competitive world or otherwise. As always, please, I really appreciate all the support. Like, share, and subscribe. And hopefully these little tips that we kind of went over today with a couple of examples helps you guys in the future with your growth, with your Blood Angels on your tabletop. So without further ado, much appreciated again, and see you guys in the next one.